Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots, and welcome back to part 3 of my Policar BRM P160 workshop, as I've now called it. So in parts 1 and 2 I went through this car with a fine tooth comb, adjusted all the little things that needed some attention, took it to the track and found out the original pinion gear was slipping, so we upgraded it for a brand new stiffened Policar new conical gear. That solved all the problems and we were able to carry on and get some really good laps with this car. So what do I want to do in part 3 with this car? Now this car has got a fairly unconventional gearbox in as much as it's got a lay shaft. Now the thing with a lay shaft is it needs bearings. You also introduce more gears, which is more wear points, and also this car has got a pair of conical gears. Now conical gears are known for pushing themselves apart, which in itself causes extra problems, or can. So what I'd like to do with this car is try and wind back the clock a little bit and take it to a more conventional gearbox where we just use a main gear and a pinion gear and nothing else. Now I've had a little go through my spares box and I believe I've acquired a certain amount of parts that could make it happen in this car. And by using that conventional drivetrain, you can lose the lay shaft in this gearbox, which means you open up a little bit of spare space inside the gearbox where we could put a bit of lead. Now this car, if you recall from part 2, had a little bit of a problem with its back end, in as much as when you're right on the very extreme of performance, the back end would go. And there's not much room on the chassis to be able to get the lead all the way back to where you really want to get it, which is right over the back wheels. However, if I'm able to remove the lay shaft from this gearbox and create that space, I might be able to put a lead liner in the gearbox, which would bring maybe a couple of ounces of weight right to the back of the car and get it right over the back axle where we need it. And that would obviously give me a lot more back end grip. Now I think that's quite an exciting idea. Also, I quite like symmetry in a car, and this car has got this disc back wheel. Not really sure if I like the disc or not. I'm kind of warming to it, but I like symmetry. So I bought a pack of wheel centers from Policar to match the front wheels. So I want to spray up those and put a 5-wheel spoke on the back. And also I'd like to replace the front suspension that I broke when I was messing around with the body, because that broke as well. So I bought a pack of parts to replace that front end suspension, and they can get sprayed as well. So I want to get you on my bench. I'll show you these parts and my thought processes, and then we'll get to the workbench and we'll start doing the work and seeing if we can make this car better, the same, or worse. So let's crack on, get you on the bench, let's go through these parts. Okay, so let's start with the cosmetics of this car. So here is the 5-spoke front wheel and here is the disc back wheel. Now I know that the disc is undoubtedly prototypically perfect, but I like symmetry, and these old F1 cars have got, in certain circumstances, a 5-spoke rear wheel. So Policar actually sell this wheel pack, and I would like to fit the 5-spoke rear wheel just because it's nice for symmetry. And there they all are laid out. Now it's just as well that I didn't actually want this particular wheel face, because as you've just seen in this packet, I seem to have been given 3 5-spokes and only 1 of those ones. So I suspect that one of these 5 spokes is supposed to have been that wheel insert, but I didn't get it. Doesn't matter, I don't want the front ones anyway, so it's not the end of the world. And there is a pair of straight discs to go on the front as well, which I don't need. Here are replacement rear discs, which I've already got on my car. And here are the very nice 5 spokes to match the front 5 spokes. So these are going on the back of my car, and they're only push out inserts, so it's no big deal to change them, and a quick lick of paint. So that's what I want to do on the back of the car, just to change the look. So as I said in part 1, these suspension arms are very susceptible to damage when you take the body off, because the body is rounded and the ends of these arms go into pockets. So every time the body comes off, these arms have to flex. Now this side of the casting wasn't glued where it meets the inner hub, so therefore the whole thing could flex. This side was glued, so it's only the arm that was flexing, and eventually after many times of removing the body, it did eventually snap off, which is disappointing. But it's not the end of the world, because Policar actually sell this replacement pack of parts, and inside this pack of parts you've got quite a lot of parts for this car. One of them is actually the front suspension parts that we need. and here are all the parts laid out. As you can see, we've got lots and lots of suspension parts. We've got the rear radiator shrouds, I assume they are. We've got the top forced induction box. We've got the engine, and we've got what looks like to be most of a driver figure. We don't have the driver's head though, unfortunately. We've got some other little bits and bobs and some bits and bobs here. We've got a very nice little steering wheel, but most importantly, we've actually got the front suspension arm that broke. We've also got the lower suspension spring that fits to it as well. So this is the part we're interested in here, and you can see how fragile these parts actually are, and you can see half of that hub there as well. So that's what we need to replace, and need to spray it up in silver and get that onto this car here to replace that little front arm. And what I will do in this particular video is I will actually cut off that little nib that's on there so that it doesn't have to now force past the body. When it goes up past the body, it'll clear nicely, because it's very well protected in there anyway. It's not in any real harm, so nipping off those ends will save any damage in the future. So that's what I'm going to do as well, is get this part here onto my car to put it back to as it should be. So now we can get to the meat of this video. Now this standard Policar motor is a 25k motor. Now this replacement slim cam motor is also a 25k motor, and as you can see it has a very long shaft, 1.5mm, the same as this one. So if I lay my replacement motor onto the top of the car, you can actually see my shaft goes right to the very back of the axle, which is more than long enough. That's an 8-tooth pinion, and this crown gear is a 24-tooth crown gear, which means that's a 3-to-1 gear ratio. Now if you mark the tyre and the pinion and then you roll the car along, you actually get 3-to-1. So this 8-tooth and this 24-tooth is exactly 3-to-1, which is what the car is. Also, this motor has a little screw hole in the top, and so does the Policar. So I believe that this crown gear, with a little bit of chopping and hacking around, will actually fit into the back of this car with my replacement 25k slim cam motor, just like that. Now there's a couple of little things here which I will need to do, one of which is to machine off all of this aluminium boss here and then bond this gear to a replacement axle. Now I'm going to need some very specific bonding agents to do that, and what I intend to do is get some proper thread lock made by the brand Threadlock, because they do a whole range of adhesives which will bond metal to metal. So this is aluminium and this is steel, so I'll need to research up and find which type of Loctite will bond aluminium to steel. Now I've used it historically in the past on some engineering projects, and I can tell you that some of the glues that they use are incredible and will actually bond this solid to that axle. What I'll also need to do is remove the shoulder of this bearing, or not remove it so much as slim it down, so that I can actually get this gear in. And I'll obviously need to trim a little bit of the gearbox top in there and obviously on the bottom as well. Now by removing this lay shaft, I will actually free up quite a bit of space around here, which I'm hoping to be able to put a little bit of lead in there, maybe 2 or 3 grams with any luck, and that will put the weight right over the back axle. And also I shall be changing these original tyres, as I will take one off now to show you. These are very, very good tyres, mine, but these are NSR Super Grips, and the NSR Super Grips fit these wheels absolutely perfectly. Now, I will need a little bit of a true, because these are part worn tyres from one of my old racing cars, or recently not used tyres off one of my racing cars, and as you can see, they fit 100% perfect. So these wheels are exactly the same as the NSR wheels. In fact, they may even be slightly wider, I don't think so, but they're a perfect fit. So a little bit of a truing on these tyres and I'll get those really, really nice. So I'm hoping that I can get my gears into my gearbox and put a bit of lead in there and change these rear tyres to NSR, and I think we might be ending up with something that's approaching a bit of a rocket ship. So let's hit the bench, let's crack on, let's start digging all this apart and seeing if we can get this car into a standard setup and get some new laps on the track and see if we can beat the existing fastest time of my NSR 997. Okay, so I'm going to start with the easy stuff at the beginning, and that's just to replace these broken plastic parts. So I'm going to pop off those wheels and then cut the little heat post on the top here, and straight away I can see that that little sketch that I did in episode 1 wasn't quite right, because this doesn't have like a bulge in the middle of it. It's actually just a flat plate. So that's the middle gone there. Now this was the side that was causing the problems because it didn't flex. So we just got to try and ease this apart, and that's not going to be that easy to do. Right, there's one side, and yeah, so this lower section is actually part of the chassis, so you definitely don't want to be cutting the lower section if you can help it, otherwise you'll be replacing the chassis. There we are. Right, okay, so this is what it looks like. Paint has seeped in there, so that was what was holding this side together, which meant that this whole section couldn't flex, which is why the arm broke off. So there we are. So there's our piece that we broke, or I broke, not we, I broke it. And then we can just scrape away whatever is there that's holding everything together, so it all sits back together again neatly. I'll just scrape that off. Now I've already sample tested this silver, and to be honest, I don't know if anybody can tell, but I actually hand painted this section here in Mr. Colour C159 silver, just ordinary everyday silver, and I honestly can't see a difference in that silver at all. So I'm going to spray my wheel centres and the new suspension arm in this silver, and then I'll compare it to these ones afterwards and just see if there's much of a difference. I'm pretty sure it'll be pretty close. If it's a little bit lighter, I just put a spot of black in with the silver just to tone it down a little bit, but I'm pretty sure it'll be all right. Now, this is the bit that I was talking about here. Now it's all in parts, you can really see what's going on. If I assemble this like this, so you can actually see what's going on, this is quite tricky. I don't want to break it again, that would be terrible. Right, here we are. So you can see that that little lug there fits inside a pocket on either side. Now that's great when it's together, but when you're trying to put it together, you've got to try and force this top bar around the body there. Now hopefully you can see that the actual body is interfering with those little posts, because the body is wider than those posts. So what I intend to do is chop off about 2/3 of those little tiny spigots on the end of these suspension arms. A little tiny spigot is just here. Hopefully you can see that there. So I'm going to just chop off 2/3 of that, and that should then clear the body as I put it on. There, now that's about 2/3 trimmed back, and what we should see hopefully is that those arms now clear the body reasonably easily without hanging up. Yes, they do. There we are. Look, perfect. See there, it's just the same width now as the body, and it just slides on nice and easily just over those two posts. And when it goes down into the body, it's just these little wings here, they're just inside the body by about 0.5 millimeter. And to be fair, that is probably all you actually need, because when you go to the other side, you can see that there's plenty of material above the body. That's not a problem at all. So that's that permanently fixed, I believe, and you should be able to take that straight off, nice and square. Yes, it does. It comes off beautifully. So that is that basically fixed. So the other thing that I've noticed when I was just doing this before I made this video is the odd little love tap that I've made on the wall of Crow Valley as I'm trying to set those fastest laps has actually chipped the wheel. Now that's actually pretty damn disappointing, to be fair. There's a good old chunk out the wheel rim there, and there's 2 chunks out of this wheel here, which is really quite disappointing. So what I'm going to do later on in this build now, I'll buy the aluminium rear wheels for this car. Now I was going to put Staff's wheels on it, that would normally be my go-to wheel, but because these wheel inserts are probably exactly made to fit the proper wheels for this car, and the wheels for this car are not expensive, they're about £7 a pair for alloy rear wheels, and they are in stock with the supplier. So I shall get a pair of alloy wheels later on in this video, and we'll pop alloy wheels on it, because that is actually quite disappointing to actually chip away the edge of those wheels. And I haven't really used, I know I have been pushing this car quite hard, but it is a bit disappointing that they're chipped. So anyway, let's get these plastic parts mounted on this stick, and then we can get some silver paint on those, and they can be drying while we're sorting out the rear gearbox. So when it came down to it, I really didn't want to spend another £7 and plus £3 or £4 of postage. So I machined off the outside of this wheel down to that first detail change, and then made up these aluminium bands. They're exactly the same dimensions as the original wheel, absolutely no different. The wall is about 10 thou thick, but it was 10 thou in plastic as opposed to 10 thou in aluminium now. So that should be quite a bit stronger than it was in plastic. And if they do break again, I can always buy the aluminium wheels, assuming of course that the alloy wheels are any stronger than these. Who knows? But the point is, these tyres fit exactly the same onto these wheels as they always did, because the dimensions are identical. And you can see that, there you go. Absolutely fine, no problem at all, exactly the same as it always was. So there's the new inserts, and here is the insert on the front. Now if you want to compare the paint, there we are, like for like, up against the black background. So you tell me which one you think is different. That's the factory one, and that's my painted one. Personally, I can't see a difference at all in that silver. I think it's exactly the same. So if you want to repaint your silver parts on your P160, it looks like it's Mr. Colour 159 for the win. So what we're going to do now is we're going to fit this front suspension back on. Now while we're here, because we may as well, you can actually see what's underneath the spring detail. And there it is there, a little flat post. So I was a little bit wrong in my original video. It's not got a bump in it, it's just flat. But while I was underneath this section here, what I've done is I've taken the chance to cut this post back just on the bottom a little bit more. I've left the top the full width, and I've just kind of sculpt it in at the bottom there just a little bit more, just to give me even more clearance on those wires. And now they clear really, really well, absolutely no problems whatsoever. And like I say, there is the spring detail on here, and that just pops down into the those little recesses there. It goes back, and now we can just pop the spring detail, the front suspension arm back on, push them down there, and they got little lugs on there, so you seat them down. And what we'll do is we'll put a spot of super glue on that top there, so it's nice and flush still, and then we can put the front axle back, put the back wheels on, and then we'll move on to the rear gearbox. And just to show you now how easy the body is to fit and what the wheels look like on this car now, as the body goes over, we can just get those posts to go on and the arms go straight on like that, no problems at all. And as you can see, the arms are nicely in place, nothing's broken, nothing's flexed, nothing's under strain. And if you want to see what the car looks like with the same wheels all round, it looks like that. I think it looks really, really smart. Okay, right, that's that. Let's get this gearbox sorted out. Okay, so let's get to the meat of this video. I have no idea if this is possible or not, but let's try and change the rear gearbox for something more conventional. Now I have noticed that this motor is actually lower than the back axle, which means the motor is going to have to be picked up and point more towards that back axle, which will probably need a bit of trimming on the inside of the body, but we'll see how that pans out. Now this is quite specific how to get this apart. So first of all, you have to use a very small crosshead screwdriver and get that small motor screw out. Then you got to try and pop that motor out of the rear cradle like that, and she's a little bit on the stiff side. You've got to be careful. What I try and do is flex the sides of this pod and push from the bottom and push down from the top all at the same time. But anyway, it comes out reasonably easy like that, no problem. And then we got some pretty cool stuff going on in the back here. We've actually got a little slot in the end of that bearing. I don't know if you can see that. Hopefully you can. So let's see. Can you see it? No, I'll tell you what. Let's take the wheel off. You'll definitely see it if I take the wheel off. Like that. Right. So here we are. We got a slot in that bearing. And what you have to do with that slot is rotate this bearing until you see a little cam appear just here, just in this opening. Let me turn that again if you didn't see it the first time. So there we are. See the little cam rotating past the aperture. So line the cam up with the aperture or the lobe, whatever, and then you've got to push that bearing out like that, and it comes out. Then what you can do is remove the main lay shaft, and then if you want to, which I guess we probably do, we can move the next bearing like that. So that's how you remove that. Now, to remove the back axle, contrary to what I did in my last video, which is to yank the whole thing out, you undo this axle stopper, move it across, and then you can get this bearing, and then you can move the bearing over, then you can move the other bearing over like that, and then the whole thing just comes out. It's actually a really, really neat design. I actually really like that design. It's a little bit involved, but it's really nice. So what we're going to have to do now is just push out those two little silver bars in there to remove this bit of detail, and then we can start looking to see if I can get this axle back in for a minute without that stopper, and then put the motor in, my long motor with the long motor shaft, and see what I need to do to get the main shaft of the motor lined up with the middle of the back axle. Okay, so you'll have to forgive me a little bit here because this is a bit of a journey of exploration. So I'm in very deep water here and I have no idea in what direction I'm going. So I'm just doing it and hoping you'll stay with me, and we'll see what we get to at the end of it. So this motor shaft was pointing too far down, or pointing flat actually, and the back axle was too high. So the back of the motor had to be lifted up slightly, which means the centre of gravity will technically be higher, but I think the advantage of having this single stage gearing outweighs that. Plus I'll be able to get some weight in the back end anyway. So there we are. So where I'm at now is this. I did actually smooth off the bottom of that motor for when I was putting it in backwards first, and that made it a lot easier to get in. But I don't need that now because I've gone in through the front, although I may still need it in a minute, who knows. So basically now you can clip the motor in from the back now and lower it in from the front, or clip it in from the front and lower it in from the back technically. So the reason why I had to get that gear off is because the axle, the slotting plus axle that I was intending to use on this car doesn't seem as quite a tight as fit on these wheels as these standard axles, which is not that surprising really. They're both 2.38, but obviously a couple of microns thicker on the Policar axle. So I've kept the Policar axle, and I just pushed this gear off on my lathe using it as a press, but that would actually come off relatively easily. You could actually put it in a vise and you could put that in the gap and tap the shaft down. It's not on that hard. It does actually come off reasonably easily. And both of these rear bearings are exactly the same size as well, so you don't need to worry about getting those mixed up, or I don't need to worry about getting those mixed up, because no one's silly enough to do what I'm doing, I'm sure. So if I was to put these bearings in the outside of this housing for now, you can actually see how much lower, or I might be able to show you how much lower that motor shaft actually is. So I could do it all kind of back to front. So here we are. So hopefully this is showing on camera. That's well low. I mean, that is quite low. So to lift that up to there, fortunately that motor shaft just touches that axle, so I'm actually able to get it to touch. So there we are. So that's more or less there, and what we end up with is a little bit of a gap down here. Okay, so this is future Rob come back to the past, because I now have the benefit of hindsight. So I'm now on a slightly different path from what I was on when I started this project. So what I've done, or what I've discovered, is that this motor was originally bedded into car body filler. So I'd taken the motor out, I'd spread a little bit of car body filler down each side, I'd put sellotape over the motor, and I put the motor in the back of the cradle, lowered the motor down and levelled up the shaft with the back axle, and let the car body filler squeeze out the bottom. Now that was to set the motor into the chassis so it had a nice solid bed on it. Then what I was going to do was make a brass bracket that fits inside of here, because I've chopped out this part of the bulkhead because I needed to lift the motor up, and that piece was in the way. So I was going to make a small brass L bracket in there using the two screws that are already in the motor to bolt it in. So I'd have a nice solid base to my motor pod, and the motor would be able to be locked into place with that bracket, and that would have given me what we call a 0 offset gear using the 24 tooth gear. Now, as I said before, the 24 tooth gear on an 8 tooth pinion gives you 3-to-1. However, I've changed course. So what I've discovered was if you wrap the motor in sellotape, you can get a little bit of squeeze out, or the corners can be a little bit untidy. And what I was finding was the filler was catching the motor, bonding to the motor, and as you pull the motor out, it was chipping the filler. So then I had to try and clean up the filler, and as I was cleaning it up, it doesn't bond that well to this plastic, and it was all breaking away. So what I've done is I've changed the car body filler, and I've changed it for JB Weld. And what I've also done is I've wrapped the motor in cling film. Now that goes all the way around that motor and pulled up tight on the top, because the cling film completely isolates the motor from the JB Weld totally, so you get a really clean impression. So that's what I've done to reset the motor in. And also the biggest change I've discovered is that when I put the body on over this system that I had here with a 0 offset, the body only just fitted onto the chassis, so that it did technically fit. I didn't actually have to grind any of the body away, even though this motor is lifted up, which did surprise me, to be fair. However, it did suddenly occur to me that if I actually use a 1mm or an offset gear, I can actually lower the motor down by the amount of offset that that crown gear has got. Now that would then give me actual clearance. It wouldn't just be really close or sitting on top of the body, the motor. It would actually give me clearance because it was tight in the 0 position. So with an offset, it would actually generate clearance. So what I did is I bought this slotted crown gear. Now this slotted crown gear is 0.5 mm smaller in diameter than this 24 tooth all slot gear. So that automatically means it's going to be slightly easier to fit in this pod because it's 0.5 mm smaller. It's not much, but every millimeter helps when you're doing this sort of thing. But also, it's an offset gear. Now, I couldn't work out what the offset of this gear actually was or is. I did ask the supplier and they didn't get back to me, so presumably they don't know either. But I know that Slotted do 0.5mm offset and a 1mm offset. So what I've done is I've actually measured here. I've done it like this. So if you've got a 2.4 axle on a 1.5mm shaft, there's a difference of 0.45 from the top of the axle to the top of the shaft. So what I did is I set up my vernier gauge to 1.45mm like this, and there's a little bit at the bottom of your vernier gauge. So when you set 1.45mm up the top, you get that little stub sticking out there. So what I did is on my second round of setting this motor in with my JB Weld, I dug out all the car body filler, lined up these sides with JB Weld, put my cling film on my motor, set the motor in at the back, got it ready at the front, set my vernier to 1.45, and I rested that there on the top of the motor shaft and pushed it down onto that axle, pushing the motor into the JB Weld. So now what I've ended up with is actually a 1mm offset between this motor shaft and the rear axle. So that means now that I've now generated 1mm of clearance, actual clearance between the motor and the body, because it was perfect at 0, but now with the motor down 1mm, I've now got actual clearance. Also, it means that the motor is now 1mm lower, which means the centre of gravity has been improved. So when all said and done, and I've not actually tried this yet, but when all said and done, I can tell you what the difference now is going to be. Actual lifting up, that's more or less 0, it's close enough. So if I push that in there and then lower that down to there, right, we got basically 1.5mm. So the motor is lifted about 1.5mm, which would have been 2.5mm, but that's fine. So that all works. And also what I've done is I've changed the gear ratio as well. So this gear, the slotted gear, is smaller than the all slot gear because it's 1 tooth less. So this slotted gear is actually a 23 tooth gear, and the all slots are 24. So the all slot was going to go on an 8 tooth pinion, which would have given us 3:1 gear ratio, which more or less is what the car is as standard. So if you go down to a 23 tooth and leave the 8 tooth pinion, you're going too fast. So come down to a 7 tooth pinion and you get 3.3:1, more or less. It's about 3.28, which means that we'll have more power but less top speed. Now, as I said earlier on, this car has already got enough top speed for me, and I'm only running it at 80% around Crow Valley. So in a worst case scenario, I just turn it up to 85%. But 80% is still going to be fast enough, even at 3.3:1. So I'll have more acceleration, more bottom end grunt, with more or less the same top speed. Or I can just turn up my volts. So that seems to have sorted out some of the other problems. And there's also a big advantage in this slotted gear as well. This all slot gear has got the boss all the way over here, which means that I'd have to take off all of that boss and then bond the gear to the axle. Now I've actually got the bonding agent now, and what I went for is this Loctite 648. So this is a massively high strength retainer. It's to retain bearings, and it's a permanent bond, which means that it's going to be incredibly hard to get it off. In fact, pretty much impossible without breaking the parts. And it's also super thin, so the wick is for very close fitting parts. I did actually contact Heikel. I think it's Heikel, the make of it. So they actually make the Loctite. I actually contacted them and they told them what I was bonding together, and they recommended this. So it's 648 is what I'm actually going to use to bond my gear to my axle. Now actually I may not ever have to, because this is another advantage to moving to this slotted gear, as well as all the other advantages. If you look at this gear, you can actually see that the mounting boss is on the opposite side of the gear to the all slot boss, which is absolutely fantastic, because there is actually a really good chance that I can get that gear into that gearbox without actually having to adjust anything bearing wise. I reckon that will go in just with plastic clearancing. I reckon that will actually go into this car without any modifications of bearings, or possibly not even the gear. So hopefully with this course correction, this is actually going to work. So let's crack on. Let's see if we can get this gear onto this axle first of all, and then we'll look at shortening the shaft and then tickling everything into place. And when I get to the other end of that process, I'll show you again what I've done, because it's easier to do it and then show you than try and explain as I go, because it's going to be a lot of back and forth fettling around. It works. I've got the gear in the gearbox working with the motor. So I had to do a couple of bits of trial and error on the route. So one of those bits of trial and error was just taking a little bit off the back of this gear, just chamfering the corner, because it was just snagging on this body when I'd scooped it all out, and I didn't want to take more plastic off of the back here because I feel that there's enough there. So I clearanced the gear. Turns out that I didn't need to do that, because when you line up this motor shaft in the middle of that gear, this 7-tooth pinion doesn't really mesh properly with this gear. So I had to move this motor shaft all the way over and force the mesh into this pinion. And the way I had to do that was I had to take this shoulder here all the way back about, I don't know, I wasn't really counting, it was about 8 thou, or somewhere around 8 thousandths of an inch ish, somewhere around there. And also what I did whilst I was doing that was I actually thought that obviously when I was moving the gear over this side, I thought I needed to thin out the bearing on this side, so I did. Turns out that I was slightly wrong, because I didn't realise that this shaft or this pinion wouldn't engage with those teeth, so I had to move the gear back over. So what I did is I took this thinned out bearing and I put it on the other side and then was working around with that. And it turns out that I need to take a little bit more off of this and get the gear all the way over a little bit more to make sure that it engaged properly with the pinion. So basically, the long story short is I ended up taking 8 thou off the surface of this bearing here, and then I ended up making a 25 thou brass shim to go between the gear and the opposite side of the gear. And now what happens when we drop all of this lot together, we can actually get a reasonable amount of side float. It's minute, but you don't want too much, because this side float is actually having a bearing on the meshing of the gear. So we actually don't want hardly any side float, but we do want some. We obviously want enough to clearance. So when that shim goes in there all the way, just square them up like that, pop the shaft through. Right, okay, so the gear is now perfectly free to turn, and I don't know if this camera is going to pick this up, but there is a small amount of side float in that gear. I don't know if you can see it. I can certainly feel it. And what happens now is when I drop my motor in, I now got perfect mesh. There are no tight spots on that gear, so obviously 1mm offset is perfectly happy, otherwise you'd feel it. And you got 100% perfect engagement in that gear off the motor, and you've got the minutest amount of side flow. I can just about see a gap down there. It's very, very small, but it is there. And you've got a very small amount of backlash in this gear. Hopefully I can show you the backlash. Let me see if I can coax some backlash for you. Hang on, try here. Right, just here, there. Hopefully the camera's picking that up. Just there. Very, very small amount of backlash, but that gear is completely free to turn. There is no grindiness. It's super, super smooth, and it's all landing exactly as it should. And there is just a small amount of play everywhere where you need it. So I don't want anything to be bound up. Right, so that's really cool. So now we've actually got a working single stage 3.3 to 1 gear ratio. So what's next is to open up this bulkhead just a little tiny bit, make a brass bracket to come down onto the bottom of the chassis. Now we know that the offset is working properly. Tidy up this JB weld on the bottom, make it look neat and tidy, and then we can get the motor fully bolted in. And once that's done, the gearbox is pretty much finished. I think that's the whole project done. So there we are, it all works. And as you can see, the actual motor pinion, the motor shaft, is tight up against this gear, but it's not tight. Like I say, there is a very, very small amount of clearance there, just enough. And that's what it needs to have that really nice backlash on that gear. This gear had to be all the way over to engage properly on this 7-tooth pinion. You might find that these gears aren't designed for 7-tooth pinions or whatever, or maybe the diameter of the normal shaft that's supposed to go into this motor, which would be a standard 2mm, maybe the actual diameter of those gears are obviously a lot bigger, and that's why they mesh properly with these standard gears. They're not designed for a 1.5mm shaft, but that meshing is 100% perfect. It's super smooth. So even if it's not designed for the 7-tooth pinion on a 1.5mm shaft, when I take away this shoulder inside this gear, it's actually clearing really, really nicely and running super, super smooth. If it wasn't, I would feel it. Okay, so maybe I should explain what I've just done there. I couldn't sleep last night because of my OCD with that over wide gap for the motor shaft to go into. So what I've actually done is I've actually machined up an O-ring that goes just inside this space, and I had to split it in half because obviously you lose distance in the cut. So I had to make two O-rings, cut them in half, file them down so they're exactly half to fit around the shaft, and I actually soldered each half into that gap there, and then machined it back on the lathe to clean it all up and give proper clearance to that motor shaft. Now that motor shaft is sitting perfectly inside the groove, and it can't allow the shaft of the motor to pull away from the gear. It maintains a really good mesh all the way through, and you can just about see that silver rim around the edge there, and that's the solder line. So I didn't want to flood this brass boss with too much heat because I didn't want to distort the nylon gear. That's why I had some paper tissue around the gear soaking in cold water to keep the heat off. But obviously I was losing a little bit of penetration doing that, so I put a ring of solder all the way around the outside, and I'm pretty sure that that will be perfectly fine. I think probably in hindsight what I should really have done is put a 2mm boss on the end of this shaft with a 1mm hole and used a standard 2mm pinion gear And then because when I originally set this gear up, I didn't actually have to take away anything off the bearings whatsoever. The original angle or the original spacing of the motor was perfect. If I'd have used a 2mm shaft, I wouldn't have had to have taken away anything. But because I used this 1.5mm shaft and left it as that, I had to move the gear over that way, which has meant I've had to take a little bit of material off this bearing and shim this side and now put in that little spacer there. So I think I've probably gone the long way around, and if I was to do this job again, I think I'd just make a spacer to go on the rotor shaft, use a standard 2mm pinion and leave the gear exactly where it is, and I think it would all fall into place beautifully. But I've gone the long way around. It's all perfectly good. There's nothing wrong with it. It all works perfectly, as you can see. That shim I've just put in there works 100%. There's now no slop in the motor shaft at all, and it's all good. So I'm at the exact same place as I would be if I did it the other way around. It's just the long way around. Right, let's get this motor into this pod. Okay, so it looks like I've managed to do it. That's all in, all nice and super smooth. And what I did with that bracket there is I put a little bit of JB Weld on the bottom of the bracket, having made the bracket deliberately too short so that the JB Weld would take up the difference. So when you bolt it down, it pulls it absolutely perfectly in line with the cradle underneath that I lined with JB Weld as well. So nothing is under tension. Put a little countersink screw in the back there as well, tapped to M2.5, and a little screw in the top of the motor there, tapped to M2, and the brass bracket's completely level with the top of the motor, so it's not lifting up at all. Back end is all in place, all perfectly working, all super smooth. And with this back detail here, I just scalloped out the bottom just a hair, just to clear that gear, because it just pokes through the bottom of the chassis by about 1/4 of a millimetre. Now I've actually finished the job, and in hindsight, I didn't actually need to take away this piece of plastic here. That was a little bit too much, but at the time I didn't know what I was doing. I was deep in, and I could probably got away with not taking that piece there. So i.e. just leave the plastic under this plate was probably all it needs to come away. But that's the beauty of hindsight. And also, as you can see, we're only about 1.5 mm step on the motor here. That's all it is. So basically not much at all. And then we've got all our float there as well, and it all works perfectly well. So if we put some power to the chassis, which is what everybody wants to see, there we go. Hang on, it's just that worked great, and then it didn't. Here we are. There you go. Absolutely perfect. Nice and quiet. Obviously it's not running at all, so with a little bit of running in, it may even be super quiet. I don't know yet, we'll have to wait and see. There we are, 100% working. Everything works exactly as it should do. Got just the right amount of backlash in there, just the right amount of side flow. Everything's nice and smooth and free. So that is the chassis done. Major step forward, obviously. So now what we've got to try and do is get this body on this gear, and I have just quickly tried fitting it, and I do know that the gear is hanging up on the inside of this body. So I'm just going to put a spot of paint on the top of the gear, see where it lands on the inside of the body, and then just dig it out with the Dremel until the body fits nicely, and then we can get it on the track and see what it'll do. Okay, so that was reasonably painless. A little bit of bodywork taken away, but not too much that actually shows when the body is actually on the chassis. It's just this little bit around here. There's still some infrastructure there to hold this side of the body on, and you've got this tie rod that comes down here, all glued in here anyway. So this part is still pretty strong, even though I've removed a lot of this plastic here. And what I've also done, just to hide it as well, not that it really shows anyway, is I've just put a little bit of Sharpie on the top edge of that gear, because it kind of shows. If you really look for it, you can kind of see it through the body, but with that little bit of Sharpie it just disappears. So when we pop the body on now, I'm just got to set the wires inside that body so it just drops down nicely. Just ease that front arm in, there we go, no problems at all. Now you can see the back wheels completely turn, and to be honest with you, I doubt that you're going to be able to see that gear through this camera, because I can't see it looking down on this car, so I don't think you're going to be able to see it either. It certainly isn't obtrusive, but it absolutely clears, no problems at all. And if we put some power to it, absolutely fine, not a problem. And we've still got plenty of really nice wiggle in the pod. Look at that, no problems at all. Right, let's button this thing up and see what you do on the track. And there we are, all finished. All the repairs on the front and the highly modified gearbox on the back. Now I understand this is a bit of an extreme job and almost nobody else will want to do it, but I just wanted to do it to see if I could. Simple as that. See if I could get a standard conventional gearbox in the back of this tiny little car, and it's worked. So having now driven it around the track, I can tell you that it is super quiet. I was worried that it would be a bit of a geary noise to it or a bit of a whine, because the original car has got a lovely sort of wispy sort of metal on metal sound. It's a lovely little sound to this car in standard form, and it was a bit of a shame to lose that for something that sounds horrible and coggy, but it doesn't. It's absolutely smooth as silk. The thing that you hear on the track is the tyres, not anything else. I was really surprised, and I was right. That 3.3 to 1 does require an extra 5% of power. I thought it did from past projects that I've done using a similar setup, and it does. It needs 85% around Crow Valley to maintain the same top speed, and that's just about perfect. Now, one small admission that I have to make is when I rebuilt this car, I put NSR tyres on it, as you saw. They were used tyres, old scrub tyres I had from a competition car. They're a bit balled up. Put them on the Truer and got them nice and flat. Not 100% flat, but pretty close. And they did actually work quite well around Crow Valley. I was quite surprised at how well they ran. They got me deep into the 40s, something like 47s or somewhere around there. But it wasn't quite getting the full speed. I wasn't quite sure that it was going the maximum it could do. So I thought, well, let's try the original PU tyres this car came with, because they were really good as standard just after truing them. Of course, I'm not going to re-true them, having put them back on the rims. I just thought I'd bung them on and see if it runs smooth. So I took off the NSR tyres after running some laps, not really getting as fast as I wanted with them. Put the old PU tyres on, couple of laps just to see if they were still nice and round, having remounted them to wheels, and they were super smooth. So I give them a clean, and then I set the lap timer going again. And this is the score she got. Look at that. It's now my fastest car by the slimmest of margins. I honestly didn't think that these rear tyres would be as good as they are on a car so light, but they really do hook in. So that little bit of extra weight in that gearbox must be doing something, because it's not quite as back-endy. I didn't put any extra lead in the gearbox like I originally hoped to, because I just didn't feel that I'd be able to get any in there in such a small space reliably so it didn't fall into the gear. But it seems to have worked out perfectly well. So what can you say? It's by the hair of a whisker the fastest car I now own. I never thought that it would be as fast as an NSR with all its suspension and all its flashy bits, but it would appear that it is. So what can you say? Now, this car started life at 44 grams. I've added 6 grams of weight to it that you saw in part 2, and then the work during part 3 here is all in the back gearbox, and she's picked up 1.5 grams somewhere. It must be in the back end, because that's the only thing I've actually messed around with. So those gears are adding 1.5 grams right on that back axle, which would explain the extra time. So the PU tyres are working that little tiny bit better for having an extra 1.5 grams right over the back axle. So there must be an advantage in weight with this car with the new gearbox, as well as obviously you've got less mechanical parts, and it runs very well with those minimal parts in it. It's now running like a normal slot car, and say in terms of sound, it's absolutely fantastic. It's whisper quiet. The only thing you hear on the track is the tyres themselves, and with the PU tyres being a little bit harder than the NSR, you've got a little bit more resonance with the PU tyres, but you get a quicker lap time with the PU tyres. So I'm perfectly happy with that. So this whole job now is totally finished. I hope you've learned something. I hope you don't do what I do and wreck your car doing it. But if you do give it a go, then always keep in mind that I would err on the side of using a 2mm shaft over your 1.5mm shaft and start at that point rather than going down the route that I went down, because the route I went down was a little bit overly complicated, and I'm sure if you made a 2mm sleeve with a 1.5mm bore in it, and then so packed out your motor shaft to 2mm and started with a standard 2mm pinion, I think you'd be a lot better. And you've seen some of the mistakes that I've made with hogging out a bit too much of the chassis underneath, so you can come in a little bit from that, and the rest of it is pretty damn straightforward. So hopefully you've enjoyed the modification of this car, and hopefully you'll subscribe to this channel. And if you do, make sure you hit the little bell button. That will be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.